As coronavirus bites, millions of people worldwide lose their jobs. Lockdowns are leading to layoffs. What's the social and political fallout, and will the job market ever recover? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Hundreds of millions of people around the world have lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. But the UN's labour agency is warning the global outlook could be much worse, as current figures exclude workers in the so-called informal economy. Well, that includes migrant and shift labourers in the developing world to freelance and service industry staff taking unprotected jobs in wealthier economies. The International Labour Organization says 1.6 billion of them could suffer massive damage to their livelihoods. This means half of the global workforce are not sure if their jobs will reappear once the crisis is over.
I have not had any income since last day of March. And I'm just like trying to survive this. We don't have an income. When we were told that go home and stay home, we are going to make sure you get your incomes by the CARE Act and by the unemployment, but that's not happening.
It's very important for us because right now we're all unemployed. My son is unemployed. The family is unemployed. It's very important for us to receive reinforcements like food to help us survive.
In the US, 20 million jobs were lost in April, while 3 million people filed for unemployment benefits in the past week. This brings the unemployment rate to 14.7%, the highest since World War II. The European Union's jobless rate stood at 6.6% in March, a slight drop from the same month last year. But the ILO estimates 12 million full-time jobs will be lost by the end of 2020. In China, official statistics indicate a small increase in unemployment from 5.9% in March to 6% in April. Well, that excludes a migrant workforce of nearly 300 million. The Economist intelligence unit says 250 million of them could see wage cuts of between 10 to 50% this year. Let's bring in our guests into the show. We have joining us from Singapore, Seng Wun, Director at CIMB Private Banking. In Geneva, Michelle Leighton, Director of the International Labour Organization's Migration Branch. And in Zurich, Bruno Verstraete, Chief Economist at Lakefieldpartners. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Bruno then. The ILO says 1.6 billion people are in immediate danger of losing their jobs right now. What would that do to the world? It's a scary scenario, is it not, Bruno?
It is. I think what it would do to the world is clearly to have less potential for consumption, where everyone was hoping that the deferred demand would eventually become a real demand again, would definitely become a demand that never comes back again. I think that is the scary thing. People will not buy durable goods, will not spend their money because they're simply afraid that they will need to have their savings used to feed their family. And that is clearly something which is out of the normal situation, and that would have very long-term effects to the economy.
Michelle, that sort of scenario, though, the loss of consumption, because people are losing jobs, they lose consumption power, is a vicious circle, is it not? Because then more people lose their jobs.
Well, certainly it's a key issue for migrant workers. We can see that so many migrant workers are already in the informal economy, where they're most at risk of these job losses. The ILO has estimated it could be 305 million jobs lost by the end of this quarter. Now, we do expect some of those jobs may come back as economies unlock and people go back to work. But I think Bruno's right. We don't know to what extent jobs will be lost for good if small and medium enterprises, which comprise most of the businesses, are not able to come back and not able to hire then you're going to have a lot of people out of work, and that will affect consumption.
Song, we're so used to hearing economists give us numbers. It's just counterintuitive to hear economists say, well, we don't know. Do we have any idea how many people are going to end up losing their jobs before this pandemic is over?
I suppose just to follow from Bruno and Michelle's point, really it will be a case of how long this lockdown, although we have seen countries lifting recession, but perhaps the fear of travel still will persist for a little while longer. So as long as there's still restriction either within the country, that although it's being lifted, or more harder and harder to do is the countries' restriction, borders, etc. may take a while to be removed, which is why when we look at the IATA in terms of what the projection for global basically passenger traffic, they're saying if we are looking at the 6 months containment, even so, passenger traffic may only take another couple more years before we get back to the pre-crisis level. So all that basically will have a significant impact on the business front, on the labor market front, and therefore overall consumption front. So it's a pretty dire picture. Much will really obviously depend on how things unfold.
That dire picture with lots of restrictions and movements of people because of lockdowns, Michelle, often hurts the least privileged sector of the labour market, the informal workers and migrant workers that you were talking about, right?
Well, that's right. That's right. They are feeling now the most acute impacts, and they are likely to feel those impacts for a lot longer and much more significantly than the workforce that's in the formal economy. And migrant workers are certainly a group of key concern. We know, for example, that 75% of women in quite a number of countries we surveyed are in the informal economy, but they're also doing jobs on the front lines, like in healthcare and healthcare services. So we don't know the impact that will have, but we know that they're already not receiving, in many cases, access to emergency economic or wage supports as nationals are. They're not receiving perhaps access to social protection. They've already been in situations where they're receiving low wages. Many have lost their jobs or trapped, not able to take up employment that they had contracts for. So they're at home without a job, or they're in destination countries in situations where they may be paid less or not at all for the work they're doing. So they're certainly much more impacted.
Very disturbing. Ultimately, though, Bruno, are we talking about the necessity of a complete restructuring of the entire world economy before we're able to deal with the fallout of COVID-19?
Well, I think the COVID crisis is like a tunnel. We don't know that. We know that it will end. We just don't know how long it will be. Living in Switzerland, we all know the longer the tunnel, the darker it is in the middle, and the hotter it turns into the middle. Depending on how long this crisis lasts, the more collateral damage there will be. One important aspect to this is that the service industry is affected much more and much deeper than the production industry. Because deferred demand in services, you cannot go back to a restaurant yesterday when it was closed. That turnover is gone. And I think that makes the service workers much more affected in that respect. And that will have long-term collateral damage. So to say we will restructure the economy, clearly we will travel differently, we will work differently, home office will become more of a recurring thing. And all of that, I think, will restructure itself. Without us doing it by our own, it will be survival. And because of that, it will be
Bruno,
restructured.
you mentioned earlier there that, not all jobs may recover. Do we have any idea of what percentage of permanent job loss are we looking at?
It's very difficult, but if we just take the tourism industry, which is about 12% of GDP in Europe, and we just look back at what could potentially happen in 2020, let's say that the 2 first months were okay, 10% of GDP will be lost in tourism in the worst potential case. That will have a huge damage to airlines recovering. So only that industry, if we zoom into one of the most affected industries because of the crisis, will have a long term to recover. Before we go back to the normal employment in airlines, for example, I think we could go back or all the way up to 2022. And by then, a lot of airlines might go bankrupt and have permanent damage to their employment.
We're hearing Song numbers like that, 2022, 2023, for different sectors of the economy. Now that we're still not sure, I mean, there's talk about, will there be a second wave? Will there be even a third or fourth or beyond wave? Do we have any idea how long recovery will take?
Your guess is as good as mine, I suppose, at this point. Really is.
No, we want you to have all the answers, Song. We want you to bring out that crystal ball.
Very fuzzy at this point. Even the best brain in IMF, World Bank, ADB, I think today basically just say that this is our assumption of where the true path perhaps is, but you have such a huge sort of a range of uncertainties around it. I mean, if coming back to the earlier point on travel and hospitality sector, we really don't know when governments are comfortable enough to allow people to travel. Even we were just talking about ourselves in terms of if we're in Singapore, we have restriction. So if part of the restrictions are lifted, when we go back to the office, it will not be everybody going back. It will just be a fraction of that, because social distancing still requires people to be separated, say in the office lifts. So all these things goes on. And for hospitality and travel, big chunk in many parts of Asia, when you're talking about, say, Bali, Thailand, Penang in Malaysia, we don't know when they will recover. So the multiplier of those drag will continue to persist through, as Bruno said, the services sector may continue to drag, even though supply chain may be looking to recover now, but obviously the demand side is going to be a big question. Let's take the auto industry, for instance. How many cars? Yes, people are returning to the factories to make cars again, but how many cars do you really need to make? So all these things remain a drag, I think, across a broad suite of activities, except perhaps in the new digital space where the digital economy, e-commerce, internet, that's driving a lot of growth and opportunity, but that's a very small sliver. It will not be able to offset the slack in demand elsewhere.
Talking about offsetting the slack in demand, if we can go back to Bruno, we've seen governments in some wealthier countries either send checks in the post directly to people or try and pick up the wages bill by providing support to companies. That's what they've been doing in Europe. But how long can governments go on picking up the slack in that way, Bruno?
Well, I think we all know that some countries already had a very high level of government debt. The good news about this one is that it's a global thing, so there's no questions asked about spending and filling the gap in between the beginning of the tunnel and the end of the tunnel, whether it is on the revenue gap for companies or the income gap for employees. I think that gap, there's a clear unanimity around the world to fill that gap. Now the question, and that will be the long-term problem, is how much debt damage is done and needs to be paid back in the long run in order to accommodate and fill up that gap. Clearly, Italy, for example, has a bigger issue than Switzerland. Europe focuses on the employment, on filling up the income. The US is more focused on providing compensation in a way for lost revenues. And of course, that outcome is a difference in policy, but clearly it's a price to be paid later on. And the weaker countries will be even weaker. The stronger countries might even, relatively speaking, be coming out of this stronger.
It's a very important point, and I want to go to Song in a moment for more on that, the debt problem. But before we do that, if I could ask Michelle, while we're talking about, you know, the formal workers in some countries are getting checks and they're getting support from governments, what about the informal economy and, you know, the migrant labour force? Are there any initiatives to support them anywhere?
Well, it's a good question. Certainly, they're often left out of the formal economy and access to the kinds of economic supports and services, including social protection, that other workers in the formal economy have access to. So they're not readily the ones getting the checks and having that kind of support, which pushes them further behind and makes them even more precarious as we try to emerge from this crisis. But there are indeed a number of countries who have extended some emergency economic relief and supports. Chile, New Zealand, Tunisia. In fact, some have asked their business communities to step up and help support migrant workers and those who are in the country who can't work, those who are most vulnerable. Even California at a state level has.
Do you see any success stories, Michelle, there that you could share with us that the world needs to look at?
Well, I mean, we see, for instance, the Philippines has initiated a fund to help migrants abroad who are in situations of vulnerability. And that certainly is something that we would encourage. And for the economic supports that are being mobilized, regardless of the region, they should be considering how to be inclusive of those in the informal economy and those migrant workers. And we know that most of them are women migrant workers who, frankly, could be able to contribute more to the workforce. And keeping a strong labor force will require being inclusive and making sure those economic support systems as well as social support systems are equitable.
Right. Song, Bruno mentioned there the debt problem that governments are going to be left with after this is over. How are governments going to deal with it, especially those which went into this already struggling with huge debts?
Well, if we look back, last 10 years, low interest rate, cheap to borrow. So we certainly have been seeing government corporates doing that. So end of last year, IMF, World Bank, they're obviously highlighting the risks of the huge pile of debt, at the late stage of a mature growth cycle. We were all just debating what would trigger the recession. It wasn't the trade fight. Turns out to be a little virus. The only thing I suppose that is going to be helpful at this time from the debt side, it doesn't look like interest rate is going to go anywhere except down and very low for a period of time. So all those debt interest payment will, if there's any consolation, not going to be overwhelmingly large. But obviously, this is something that...
Would it even help, though, or would it completely solve the problem rather than help, Song? I mean, this is not your average crisis where the government simply lowers the interest rate and increases spending, right?
Yeah, no choice. Especially if we look around, when you really have to roll with the punches, it's really about what we've been talking about earlier, trying to roll out measures to help businesses to retain workers. We really don't know how long we need to keep businesses retain workers to cap unemployment from exploding. And so all these things essentially will continue to play out. So I think the next 3 to 6 months will be very important in terms of how the pandemic pans out and to what extent whether there will be more debt that need to be issued to help fund government sort of effort. Essentially, if private consumption is going to be continue to be depressed, government stepped up to help to cushion some of the impact. Obviously, they cannot replace that, but they will just continue to have to do so in this kind of environment when private sector confidence remains very fragile at this point.
That's precisely one of the key problems here, Bruno, is confidence is very fragile. Is there anything more governments can do to step in and restore consumption confidence that can in turn spur investment confidence so companies go out and re-establish production chains and hire people?
Well, I think they can hope for inflation, and that inflation might be the result of looking at the supply chain fragility that we've seen in this crisis to bring the employment closer home. I think that is the desire of some of the governments out there, which makes products more expensive. The fact that there would be, for example, less airlines would make the prices go up. So that would, in a way, cure the debt problem to a certain extent. Inflation, which was almost absent over the last period of time, might come back, and that would be helpful to the government. I don't fully agree with the fact that the interest rates will remain low, simply for the fact that the offer of outstanding debt is going to go up a lot. The demand might change, not change, even go down because there's less money available to save. And as such, the interest would go up because everyone is competing for the same investor. So interest rates might go up and might make the issue into a bigger issue later on. It's not systemic yet, but it could turn into something systemic quite early on. So inflation is basically what the governments should hope for, and growth to come back.
Michelle, we should also perhaps remember that while we're talking about workers in some countries getting checks in the post or getting support for companies to pay their wages, that's not all the countries in the world that are doing that, right? So what's happening even to the formal workers in less wealthier countries and economies?
Well, they're being left behind, and they're being left out, and they're being, more and more in precarious situations. And certainly it's concerning. We see food insecurity, further discrimination and xenophobia on the rise, and many people are really struggling. But to get back to one of the points raised before, how do we see emerging from this crisis? I think policy matters too. It's not about just economic supports. It also means that we have to take this opportunity to build back stronger. And that will require really examining our governance strategies and our governance policies to really include those people who are being left behind. They bring lots of talent and skills to the workforce, but their skills and talents aren't necessarily recognized. We think that, for instance, if you can create policies which have much more coherence, for example, migration policies with education and training and employment policies, it means you're going to look at issues like skills development, not just of the national workforce, but of your migrant workforce, looking at social protection extension and the portability of Social Security entitlements, and examining how rights can really be protected in a fair and effective framework. We have the opportunity now to do that, and that's the opportunity we should take by looking to the mid and longer term.
Do we have the money to do that is probably what governments would argue.
Well, it's going to take a concerted effort by all, and certainly we advocate social dialogue, which means bringing in business, bringing in the trade unions, bringing in all of the relevant stakeholders, the ministries of labor and so on, to really tackle this issue. But we have faced crisis before, and we can emerge. Right. There should be inclusivity, though, also in the design of these policies, and that will make them more durable.
Song, I wonder if you could shed some light, I should say, on one interesting aspect of this. This pandemic, of course, began in Wuhan in China, and now the recent statistics talk about only a slight uptick in unemployment, and even in some cases, some of the economic indicators, I think it was exports, some sectors of exports, looking positive for China. How?
Well, I suppose again you're talking about China being an important production supply chain. If we are just here in Singapore, for instance, if I go down to our supermarket, plenty of food stuff from the Chinese side. If I look at manufactured stuff, quite a lot of stuff from China, either is intermediate or final goods as well. So I would say the rebound after the February lockdown really just was all about supply chain, I suppose, recovering somewhat. It's still not, I think, back to what it used to be. It's certainly what we are or are likely to be. We saw in today's, I think, statistics from the April side, a recovery on industrial production side. I think that's if there's anything, a good thing from a centrally planned economy, that they essentially can direct businesses to say all hands to the pump, because orders need to be fulfilled. So this might just be temporary in terms of the pickup. More importantly is whether the consumption within China itself has recovered. It hasn't. If we look at retail sales, for instance, it's still very weak. I think, again, it comes back to the confidence issue is, are you going to be spending in an environment where you still are not quite sure whether it's going to be second wave, third wave? Right. So there's still a bit of restraint on the spending side. So it's going to be still very mixed, I think, coming out from China to be able to stabilize, say, the region or the rest of the world.
Very mixed, very unpredictable, but thanks so much to our guests for sharing their insights into this important topic. Thank you very much, Michelle, Bruno and Seng. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami, Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.